All right, Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Liberty and Friends here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. As you can see on screen there, what I usually ask you to do at the beginning of the show. But hey, where are my manners? My name is Sihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. And as always on Liberty and Friends, this is the one long format show that we have. And we bring you a revolving door of voices, critical thinkers, thought leaders, and analysts, guys who can help us unpack the news week that was. What are some of the issues that made you smile, angry, or even frustrated at being a South African? We do that here and nowhere else on the Big Daddy Liberty channel. And as a reminder, whether you're watching this show on Facebook, X, or on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that like button as you saw earlier on. Smash that like button, please, on your screen. And if it is on YouTube, do me an even bigger favor, like the show, or pardon me, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Ordinarily, I say, help me reach my goal of 45,000 subscribers by the end of the year, but we have reached that goal. Yes, as of yesterday, we broached that 45,000 subscribers mark. So a massive kudos and thank you to you, dear viewer, and hopefully it grows from here. Maybe the next target should be 46,000 by the end of the year. We'll work towards that. Again, thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed. And a reminder, please, as I always do, you can find us on our website at BigDaddyLiberty.com. Now, enough with the jibber jabber on my side. As usual, I'm not alone on a Sunday evening. We have the Friends panel this weekend. And of course, from the organization Solidarity, of Solidariteit, as we say in Afrikaans, is meneer Peirru Marx. Wat is die Peirru, wat doen jy by Solidariteit? Hy's die health coordinator of iets soos die...
I'm the medical sector coordinator. Good evening, everybody.
Medical sector coordinator. I want to let you just tell us briefly what it is that you do exactly as a medical sector coordinator at Solidarity.
Yeah, so basically we are dealing with all the labor issues related to medical divisions. So me and my team basically represent individuals that form part of all the different medical networks. So at Solidarity, we've got obviously sectorial groups that for example, we've got the doctors group, we've got the nurses group, we've got the pharmacist group, and then individuals will form part of that grouping. And then we bind them into occupational grouping, and then basically deal with their concerns and related issues through those how can I say, combined efforts.
Absolutely. And indeed, those combined efforts we'll talk about in a moment, with you guys having secured a massive court victory this week. We'll get to that in a moment. I'm not joined by Peirru alone, but we're also joined by Makone Maja, who is, of course, from the Institute of Race Relations. Makone, good evening, ma.
Good evening, Sihle, and I also want to say congratulations on that massive milestone of 45K subscribers. It's a worthwhile goal, and kudos to you and your viewers.
Yes, thank you very much for those kind words. And indeed, let's perhaps get into the conversation tonight. As always on Liberty and Friends, it's not just the Friends panel who join us every evening, but you, dear viewer, are part of the show. Get your comments in and we'll roll them across the screen. Indeed, also get your questions in if there's anything you want to pose on each of the topics that we'll discuss tonight. Good evening, welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. And perhaps let's begin with people who I'll generally consider the friends of South Africans, that is the organization Solidarity, as I said, registering a massive court victory this week. Again, I'm struggling to get this out because it's so unbelievable that we're tasting the first bits of fruit of victory. And again, I'm going to be cautious and not jinx anything, because on this channel for a very long time, we've been fighting the NHI, or the National Health Insurance then bill as it was being proposed, and now law as it's been signed into law by the president. And we've still stand firmly opposed to this piece of legislation, and we've underpinned why the NHI is a problem. But beyond me just waffling about it, I've always said there are organizations like the Institute of Race Relations, the Free Market Foundation, Solidarity, who have actually been fighting this piece of legislation in the courts. And let's get into exactly that first win that I'm talking about. I'm going to put on screen the press release from Solidarity so we can see exactly what it is that is, as I'm doing this, we'll see exactly what that transpired in court, of course, over the past week. I believe the court decision was on Monday, Peirru, if I'm not mistaken, but nonetheless, there it is on screen. Let me just make it a bit more legible. There it is, cornerstone of NHI taken down in court. Solidarity has succeeded in taking down one of the major cornerstones of the proposed national health insurance. This came after the North Gauteng High Court, of course, declared sections 36 to 40 of the National Health Act simply unconstitutional. This decision coming with costs on behalf of Solidarity. Now, I'm going to go to you, Peirru, because I think you need to unpack this for us. Because as I've sort of said on the channel before, there's two elements when it comes to the dangers of the national health insurance. The first, of course, is the centralizing of funding from basically confiscating people's funds aimed at healthcare to place it in one big pot called the NHI fund, which is obviously controlled by politicians and who they decide will run and decide where payments go, making the state the single payer healthcare. That was the first risk. The other risk, of course, was the centralized nature of the control of healthcare, basically removing decision-making from both the providers of healthcare, doctors, pharmacists, nurses, you name it, and of course, removing decision-making from us, individuals, families, really, and placing it into the hands of government. It seems that last bit is where you guys have notched quite a serious victory. What happened?
Yeah, thank you for the time. Obviously, it's my first time that I'm a guest at your show, so well done for the 45,000. I know it's a big struggle to get there. So once you are there, it can only go better. But from our side, yes. Look, let's first understand what the con is. So if we talk about the certificate of need, so that's basically section 36 to 40 of the National Health Act, and basically what it does, it gives the government, specifically Director General, the powers to decide where you can practice. So basically that is in essence what it means. So if we just go quickly into the different sections, so 36 basically says who requires a certificate and the procedure to be followed. So in other words, basically any healthcare facility that offers healthcare services must be in a possession of a certificate of need. Otherwise, they cannot render services. And then basically, if they're not in possession of a certificate, they will be liable to penalties as well as criminalization with regards to their actions. And that is actually number 40. But if we then go to 37, that talks about the duration and validity of the basically the legislation or the certificate. And that basically says that it has an expiry date. So they're talking about 20 years. Now, the risk involved here, and you need to understand, is if you build a facility, we're talking about upward of 500 million that you're going to pay to build a hospital. No investor is going to invest money into a business where there's no return on investment guarantee. Because remember now, this certificate can be taken away as well. It doesn't mean you will go the full 20 years. It all depends on whatever decision is being made, or the Director General based on his his own discretion, because that's the power he's got. And you must understand that the rules is not written yet, as well as what's going to guide us. And this is one of the issues, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. Then, obviously, if we go to 39, that empowers in the making of regulations in terms of section 90 for the determination of what is to be considered when issuing and reviewing. So that is exactly what I'm talking about now. So that is basically where that is not present yet. Some of the arguments has been that, this legislation has not been implemented yet. Why are we in court about it? Then obviously our concern has always been we don't have to wait for damage before we do something. We need to be upfront, challenge legislation that is not to the benefit of the community, and then obviously take it from there on. The main thing is those points have been argued in court, where they have reiterated the fact that they don't believe that we should be in court yet because it's not rolled out. But the main thing is here, once it was signed into law, it became an act of government. And once it's an act of government, obviously the courts may rule on it. So that is exactly whether they've implemented it or not. The courts have then the ability to rule on it. And then that is on that basis, we basically took them to court. So I'm just going to quickly run through the reasons why we took it to court. So you need to understand, first of all, we indicated from day one that it's irrational. It's an irrational part of the legislation. It simply doesn't make sense. It can't be implemented. So it's broadly vague. So in other words, you don't actually know what exactly is the intention here. And then lastly, it basically contravenes many constitutional rights. And the constitutional rights referred to in our referral is the right to human dignity, the right to freedom of movement and residence, the right to choose a trade, occupation, profession, the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of property, the impermissible expropriation of property, and the right of access to healthcare. So those were obviously the constitutional grounds on which we took this matter to court. And then obviously, if you can quickly just indulge me, the parties that were part of the initial how can I say, legislation, because you need to understand the challenge that we brought against government. This is not the first time we're in court for this part. We won this before. It was also in our favor. And then you need to understand that during our first court case, government did not show up. So the point here is that if it's such an important part of the legislation, which they are claiming now, why did they not show up in the first case? So obviously the first case was heard. It was also in our favor. It was rescinded. In any case, government wanted to go back. They said it's important. They want to be able to obviously give their point in court, to have their day in court. That was done, and then the parties remained exactly the same. So there were a few individual parties that formed part of our application, but then obviously, associations like Alliance of South African Independent Practitioners Association, South African Private Practitioners Forum, as well as Hospital Association of South Africa. So those were the big, obviously, guys that joined up with solidarity, that said, listen, we're going to join this fight. We're going to fight this part of the legislation. And then obviously they were part of the applicants. So as you're well aware, and as you've discussed during the intro, as it was in our favor. In other words, the court found that it's unconstitutional and it should be taken out of the act. In other words, it can no longer appear there.
Let me just come in here because, again, all of the points you're raising are arguments that have been made in what was then the run-up to this legislation, especially during the public consultation. And as was the case with the arrogance of the political elites in this country. Oh no, they said, don't worry about all these unconstitutional elements. Just trust us, the politicians and the political elites, to roll out universal health care, they called it. You remember they paraded various organizations and the the World Health Organization at a massive press briefing, with all the who's who of this sort of collectivized state socialist type healthcare regimes. And they said, NHI would be great, they said. Just give us control and you'll see. Everything will be the land of milk and honey. And clearly, if the arguments you've made are anything to go by, it simply isn't the case when you look at the nitty-gritties. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Makone, but I just want to read from that same statement, a quote from the CEO of Solidariteit, Dirk Herman. Basically, a very powerful point he makes at the end. Let me just put it back on screen. There it is. And hopefully it's legible for my viewers. Let me try and make it a bit bigger. That should, yeah, it's better. Basically, he's quoted in that same press release as having said, look, the medical sector in South Africa does not need yet more state bureaucracy. And I fully agree with them, by the way. But as a matter of fact, we have to empower and encourage our health practitioners. This type of legislation leads to poorer care, a sicker country, and an indignation from medical practitioners whose rights would have been trampled on as a result. We are delighted by this ruling he mentions on as it helps the South African healthcare sector. With that being said, the legal opinion that Peirru is sharing is not just isolated to his organization, but really other legal voices, other legal experts have been sounding the alarm in the same breath. I want to go to this particular piece in the Business Insider business tech. And as I'm doing that, folks, remember, hit that like button, smash that like button, and share the stream. Let the folks know that Liberty and Friends is on. There it is. Let me just make sure it's on screen. Yes, it is. Again, this is according to workmen's or Vatmans, who are legal experts who had previously explained in relation to this legislation that the National Health Act's provisions for a, quote, certification of need would make it that no person may operate an existing health establishment, increase the number of beds in such an establishment, or construct or open a new health establishment without being in possession of one of these certificates. The definition of health establishment is incredibly wide. It gave government wide berth to make things up, basically, and would easily include almost any place where a service is available, including pharmacies, general practitioners, consulting rooms, and of course, hospitals. Makone, I'm going to come to you here because there is a question around the truly asinine nature of how government and effectively politicians think about healthcare. There's two fundamental logical fallacies here. The one we broadly call bounded rationality. It's this idea that no one can know everything, right? And that's why you want as many individuals who each to pursue their own self-interest, and the greater collective good of that is us responding to those interests. That's what the market is called. So in other words, if people want apples, I as a producer of apples will never know how many people need apples. However, I can respond to incentives that the market gives me and then produce accordingly. This piece of legislation would effectively stop that relationship and put it into the hands of officials and politicians to guess where we need hospitals or GPs and the like. Why was this a problem?
Absolutely. There seems to be a conflict between individuals' pursuit of happiness and what the government thinks the individual should be in pursuit of. But I did want to say congratulations to Solidarity. This is a huge historic moment. Typically, civil society organizations and trade unions alike get a bad rep in this country, and we know why. But I think this is one of those lone moments where civil society and trade unions are leading and are lone stars, emblematic of freedom and the defense of individual liberty in this country. So well done to Solidarity. I did wonder, though, why the initial challenge to sections 36 and 40, which first appeared in 2015 at the Concord as the courts of first and last instance, were not upheld, because then it was the president who actually approached the Constitutional Court to have the promulgation of sections 36 and 40 be declared unconstitutional. The president himself recognized at the time that the presidency, along with the ministries of health, particularly the Minister of Health and the DGs, were misled and misguided about the certificates of need and whether or not they can actually come into effect. Because in 2015, the promulgation of the entire National Health Act, along with those sections 36 and 40, would mean that any health facility operating at the time was operating illegally because they would have not had those certificates of need, right? So there was a clear conflict there. And a clear presumption on behalf of the Act to enable and bring into law such provisions. And so I was wondering specifically why those challenges, which for Solidarity, I think they approached the high courts, which of course is how it goes. But at the president's approaching the Constitutional Court, I would assume that weighs heavier in terms of precedent, given that the Concord is the final court in the country. Why then that judgment wasn't upheld then? But I do agree with a lot of what Peirru said, especially about the 20 years, the certificates of need being granted for 20 years. That's just an arbitrary amount. How do they come up with those figures? Those are entirely made up. They just introduce more bureaucracy, right? And I also wanted to ask, perhaps Peirru can enlighten on this, being somebody who's within the trade union industry. Why haven't we had other trade unions join Solidarity in this action? Why have we had trade unions like Nahau and Samatu support specifically legislation that counters the interests of their employees, which they're supposed to be defending, right, and acting to protect and secure? You would think that trade unions would understand that if you're making it difficult for healthcare facilities to operate in this country, that means less people are getting employed in the health industry, which for their own self-interest means less membership. So why have we not had more trade unions come forth and challenge the NHI, if not for the interests of their members, which they're supposed to be acting on behalf of, their own interest in terms of thinking about prospective membership and thinking how the introduction of more bureaucracy, which is going to slow down the creation of healthcare facilities, would impact them. But I think this case blows the top off centralization, which is a key component of the NHI. The idea that government is going to decide where people get to work, but also there's this insistence by government to operate equitably, right? That's the whole point, is that they intend on forcing healthcare facilities to set up in specific areas that government would, in their own goals and pursuits, would want them to operate in, despite the fact that you just don't see the infrastructure heading into those areas. Government wanted to force the hand of the private sector by quashing the existence of competition in the healthcare industry, by forcing them to operate in those various locations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, I must come just a moment, Peirru, because I think Makone raises a few issues with nested features that deserve our attention, and I'm going to throw them to you. But as I pose this question to you, there's two things I want to speak to, because there's going to be the accusation now, as is usually the case in these matters, especially when you have an organization like Solidarity or the IRR, or so-called white organizations, the usual tropes we hear on social media. And they'll say things like, oh no, Solidarity only took government to court because it hates Black people, they'll say. And it wanted to prevent NHI, which gives equal access to healthcare. How dare do these white people deny the poor Black the opportunity at healthcare in this country? I wanted to speak to that criticism, and please demolish it. And the second one is, we're also forgetting here that even though it's Solidarity at the heart of this court action and victory, it is going to be a lot of healthcare practitioners who are not members of Solidarity who are beneficiaries of this victory. Let me be precise and specific. Take a drive, Peirru, Makone, into any township in this country. Maybe take a drive into my home township of Umlazi, and you'll see a mushrooming of private healthcare facilities by the way of, at the most lowest level, a GP in a small office, and at more larger level is these GPs coming together and forming these almost quasi hospitals, if you will, where there's multiple GPs, pharmacy, pathology, you name it, all the associated services. And the prices there are at a requisite level where poor people are actually able to access that and escape the terrible, the crap, the shit, if you will, that is the public hospital. It is that relationship between the poor individual and the doctor who provides services to poor people that would have been destroyed by these key pieces of legislation that politicians were pushing via the NHI. So those two areas, Peirru, I want you to speak to. One, the criticism that you're doing this for whites only. And of course, the other is that actually it's a lot of members who are not Solidarity members who are benefiting from this court action.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start with the last bit. Obviously, from Solidarity side, when we fight, legislation that's simply irrational, like Section 36 to 40, we do it for everybody. It's not for a specific grouping. It is for the profession. So with regards to how we deal with issues, whenever there's litigation being brought against a piece of legislation, that is based on the fact that that legislation is not going to serve the communities. In other words, it's not going to result in overnight specific, enhancement of healthcare facilities. I think we all wish that we had a government that would take responsibility for their failure in the public health system, that will take accountability for their failure. I'm sure we all hope for that, but that's simply not going to happen. They even before the polls, even before the voting started, they thought that the NHI is going to bring them additional votes in. Hello, most of your staff is on a medical aid. And that actually gave them a drop of 4% at the polls. You had senior officials before voting started saying that the ANC have invested in GEMS, which is the government medical aid, and they're not willing to let it go. So they want to be exempted from NHI. In other words, they wanted to keep their health benefit, and the rest of South Africa have to deal with the rest. So coming to the second part of your question, or the first question, and that entailed, what now? How are we going to deal with this criticism with regards to who is dealing with this? For who is this? So the main thing that one needs to understand is we're not going to resolve the issues in the health sector by legislation and a piece of paper. It's never going to be resolved by a piece of paper. If you do you have the political will to do the right thing. In other words, put the patient first. You would then sit in consensus-seeking negotiations with the private sector, with medical aids, trying to find solutions for South Africa need. It's no use, going to the community and telling them, yeah, but overseas, there's many systems like this. They do not have South Africa. We have a unique system. So one needs to understand what is universal healthcare in South Africa. So universal healthcare in South Africa simply means we do all have access to healthcare. The issue here is that we don't have quality healthcare, and the quality is the issue that we need to address. So we've got two systems. We've got a private healthcare system, which is way too expensive. It's not without flaws. One needs to understand we are not saying private healthcare is better. We are saying there's also things that needs to be addressed there. That we can look at cheaper options. Privatization has always shown that the more you privatize, the better results you get. So we are saying get more people on medical aid. It's as simple as that. Look at cheaper options. Make sure that we get more people on medical aid so that the burden on government is less. In other words, we can lessen the burden on government because, yes, they are responsible for about 80% of the country's health needs. That we all know, and about 20% is private healthcare. Yes, there is over servicing in private healthcare. We know this. That can be addressed through, like I said, consensus-seeking negotiations and finding better alternatives. And then we've got a public health sector system that takes care of the rest, and that's also universal healthcare. In other words, the two systems needs to find a way to work together. So the main issue here is what is the way forward? I don't know if I need to go on with that, but what is the way forward now? The main thing that we need to understand is we need to get the people around the table. We need to deal. I heard earlier a comment regarding the staff itself and the influence on that. I can tell you now, and I think one of the topics we're going to discuss this evening is also got to do with those officials that took money, and that specifically can be bound to the reputation of government when it comes to money that's intended for public health. So the main thing that we need to now do is we need to get to a position where we sit around the table, discuss the manpower issue. I can tell you now, we can sit a whole evening and discuss the challenges we're going to face. And I can quickly just run through a few numbers. If we talk about registered nurses, in other words, all qualifications registerable at SANC, we are talking about 4.5 nurses per 1,000 patients. This is where we are. We're supposed to be around about close to 9 per 1,000. We are actually at the moment, if we look at registered nurses, which is the higher qualification, registered nurses and midwiferys, we're sitting with 1.4 per 1,000 patients. That is where we are. It is ridiculous because the main thing that you need to understand is that even if you look at the age profile, majority of nursing staff will retire within the next 10 years. We are sitting with less than 6% of registered nurses currently below the age of 30. So we have a huge generation gap. We are not going to be in trouble. We are already in trouble when it comes to healthcare because we simply don't have the staff that needs to render the services. Now, once again, if we come back to why do we challenge things like this, it's because these healthcare professionals put themselves in groupings, so they affiliate with people like Solidarity to act on their behalf because the government is expecting them to render the services under the NHI, but they simply don't believe in it. And that is the biggest challenge government is still going to face because the very same people they believe is going to roll out the services, do not believe in them. They want to go to communities like you have highlighted. They want to open their practices. They want to render services within those communities and address health needs. And obviously from there on build relationships with their patient, because that's how it works between a doctor and a patient. You build a relationship with your doctor. You don't want to build a relationship with government. There's no way we can sit here and argue that me going and adding 40 million people on your medical aid and expecting you to pay for it is going to change anything going forward, because that's exactly what NHI is. It is basically telling you that we need to put 40 million on your medical aid. And I mean, these officials are not even scared and saying those that have more must pay more. The main thing here is that even everybody that sits out there is under, this idea that it's free. It's not free. It's being paid by everybody that works. So it's not a free healthcare system. It is funded by tax money. And if we're going to look at tax money, it means that even if we just look at personal tax needs to be raised over 30%. You need to obviously look at corporate tax that needs to be raised. The economy needs to grow above 4% or 5% even. And then maybe in 2046, we can afford NHI. And that's the reality that we are going to face. If we had to roll NHI out now, we're going to sit with a deficit of about 209 billion just in this financial period. So it's simply not affordable. And that's always been our argument. It's not affordable. It's not implementable. It is irrational.
Absolutely. And just with that being said, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. Welcome to it. We're at the half-an-hour mark of the show. This is Liberty and Friends. My name is Hlophe JSC, in conversation with Peirru Marx from the organization Solidarity, the trade union out in Pretoria. And of course, Makone Maja, who is from the Institute of Race Relations. We're talking national health insurance. It's being dealt a quick 1-2 by the courts this week in our favor in real terms as South Africans, basically putting the brakes on that notion of it being a centralized or centrally controlled piece of legislation, denying us, the ordinary citizen. I like to say we are the faith, flag, family, and freedom type citizenry, denying us the ability to make choices around our healthcare, and equally denying healthcare practitioners in this country the ability to meet our needs as patients, as customers, clients, nonetheless. So Solidarity doing some great work in that regard. With that being said, guys, let me remind you, I'm seeing a collective of about 450 plus people over the various platforms. Do me a solid favor, smash that like button, please. Do me that favor. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. Guys, I'm going to have us sort of wrap up this bit of the conversation by looking at, so we've looked at what is, we've examined how Solidarity have put the brakes via the courts of what is, because what is right now was toxic as hell. But someone might be watching and going, okay, cool, guys. So then how do we achieve quality universal healthcare? Because as Peirru rightly mentioned, access to healthcare has never been an issue in this country. You can walk into any public healthcare facility and receive help. The issue is, are you going to receive that help on time? And is that help of a quality, a requisite quality level? And equally, are these facilities equipped to deal with the various intricate health issues in this country, what's broadly called the burden of disease in this country? Those are the real issues, to which NHI has zero answers to that, and effectively just says, well, look, let's just centralize everything, put the money into our hands as politicians and hope for the best. And we clearly can't have that. So I'm going to have the conversation now around what would we then propose. I'm going to throw it to you, Makone, first, and then I'll come to you, Peirru. And here's the idea I often put out. Of course you want to help the poor, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, you guys are just opposed to poor people, or black people is usually the trope. But the reality is we're saying, no, of course you want to help the poor, those who especially can't afford quality healthcare. And the best way, and Peirru's hinted to that, is to allow ordinary individuals, especially poor people, to have the very same access that we in the middle class have, which is a medical aid, the ability to have health insurance that looks after you and backs you up, if you will, when you then have a problem. The issue becomes, how do we do that? Do we do that by giving the power and the resources to the state? Or do we do that by giving the power and the resources to you, the individual? And I often advocate for health vouchers, the idea of taking the budget that the Department of Health spends, breaking it up into vouchers, and effectively prioritizing giving it to the poorest of South Africans for them to purchase their own healthcare. And of course, that addresses the demand side. In other words, those who demand or need healthcare services now are able to afford them via having their own medical aids, right? And then the supply side, those who provide these services, as Peirru rightly said, stop meddling with them, allow them to grow their businesses and meet that demand. And now if you have millions of poor South Africans suddenly having their own medical aids, the demand is there. You'd see a flourishing of such healthcare businesses, especially in our townships and rural areas, to meet this demand. Makone, sorry, am I wrong in my assessment? What does the IRR sort of generally have as a position on this? How do we fix healthcare?
The Institute's position would be more freedom, not less. So definitely decentralization. I think what we're seeing is that the government is evading the difficult work of actually solving public health care, which of course there is a crisis, right? And it largely affects poor people. That although we do have healthcare facilities and actually do have universal healthcare in the sense that anybody anywhere can access a hospital nearest to them for free, a public hospital nearest to them, why does the government not want to do the job of getting us from quantity, which is again widespread access to public healthcare, to quality, actually improving the provision of healthcare services in public hospitals? The government wants to rather scapegoat the issue of inequality and latch onto something other than what it should actually be doing, which is strengthening services in public health, in public health care, specifically public hospitals. And you also see this in how the government has been blocking access to and the provision of low-cost benefit options. Government has been actively sabotaging attempts for companies to bring forth medical aid services that are cheap and accessible and affordable for the poor people who they pretend to care about when they want to usher in a nefarious centralized bill like the NHI, which is really just about government power, right? I think that exposes that the state, the decrepit state of public service, of public healthcare in this country, alongside the NHI, and the fact that the government is actually blocking companies that are trying to come up with cheaper services, just shows that it has nothing to do with the poor. So we can stop playing that game, but it also equally has nothing to do with caring about the quality of healthcare in this country and whether or not it trickles down to the least privileged in society. So absolutely, the healthcare vouchers would help, but certainly also allowing companies to come forth with ideas and ideate about how to make healthcare cheaper in this country.
Absolutely. Peirru, I'm going to throw it to you. Same question, really. How do we fix the healthcare issue? Of course, there is a collective understanding that, yes, you want poor people to have access to quality healthcare like anybody else, right? And you want them to be able to afford it themselves. I'm pushing out the idea of a health voucher as one such avenue of assisting the poor in particular to get access to quality. But surely Solidarity has some 1-2 points that it'll throw out on how do we fix the healthcare system?
Yeah, thank you. I think Makone and myself are singing from the same hymn book, the same verse, the same line. She's already addressed many of the issues that we need. I think from our side, if we can just add on what she's already said, is the manpower issue. Look, we are sitting with staff that are trying to render services in public healthcare facilities, and just for my background, I used to work in many public facilities. I didn't work for a trade union all my life. I used to manage laboratories, so I worked in these facilities and I saw them depreciate in front of my eyes. So I know exactly how it looks in government facilities because I worked at about 6 of them. So that is the main concern that I've always had, is you've got staff that's really passionate about patient care. That's why they chose the profession in the first place. They want to help people. That is why they are there. These are, loving individuals that are really highly trained and professional in what they need to do. They need to render the services, and then the main thing that is they overwhelmed because the majority of people that present at these facilities, like I said, 80% of the country needs to be serviced by the government specifically. in public health system, they simply don't have the manpower. So if we looked at the shortages in staff and address those, that would be obviously adding to what has already been said, one of the major things that needs to be dealt with. And then obviously the very same people that need to render these services, talk to them, because they are the experts when it comes to what is necessary in the communities. We have touched on the nursing shortages. We haven't even spoken about doctor shortages. We are sitting here with 0.3 doctors per 1,000 patients in our country in the public health system. That is where we are. Those are the figures. If you look at recent things that has been in the media where you're sitting with a government that wants to roll out NHI, but you're sitting with media coverage of over 800 doctors that's willing to render services, but there's no alternative option for them because the government or the public health system do not want to entertain appointing them into positions because they simply put forward always money. It's always a budget excuse. They don't have the money. As we sit here, I'm sitting with groupings of doctors and all professions for ComServe. You need to understand every 6 months we are sitting with these issues where staff that need to finalize their qualification with regards to community service are unable to render their services. So fix the basics. So what I'm coming to is fix the basics because we can't even place people for community service. We are saying we want to get healthcare service to communities, but we can't even place them into the community to render those services. And this is every 6 months it's the struggle. We are sitting now with a whole bunch of doctors, exactly the same problem. They are not being placed into the community service. They can't finalize their qualification and they can't render their services. So they're obviously sitting at the back of this process, seeing firsthand what happens when it's centralized, because once again, it's being done through a central position when it comes to placements, and it's not assisting, it's not dealing with the issue. And that's why we need to find, better ways going forward to get the manpower sorted out. And then obviously, as a last point, is the professional bodies that deals with their registration, in other words, SANC and HPCSA, they need to be more accountable. They need to be more involved because they, in the end, they have to belong to these professional bodies. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what do they actually do except gather some registration fees? So my biggest concern is they should play a more central role in healthcare because these are their individuals, these are their assets that obviously are registered under them, and they need to take a central position going forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. You're not wrong. Again, I'm listening to this body of points you're making, and none of you are wrong. We have a problem in this country of people who believe that just because we are all saying that, South Africans broadly and more specifically the poor should have access to quality healthcare, that then means the government should control all aspects of healthcare. That is simply not the case. And as Peirru rightly points out, it is the case right now, and it is a mess. The story of the 800 doctors who were picketing, some of them were picketing outside the Pretoria head offices in KZN, because they had not been placed. These are young doctors who just graduated looking for opportunity, is a tragic one. But it is a tragic one because the state is in control of allocating, basically picking winners and losers in society. The moment you give politicians and government officials that power, you have these problems, these I want to call them state-created shortages where there really aren't any, or substantive shortages, and they're exacerbated by poor decision-making in the state. And then on the same hand, sorry to belabor this point, but it's such an important one, you've got to sit around the table, as Peirru pointed out, and actually rope in the private sector in all facets, from top to tail when it comes to healthcare, in terms of the training of healthcare practitioners, whether it's our nurses or our doctors. It is a scandal, a shame that in this country we shut down nursing colleges that were producing nurses of a quality that the world over was sapping up. A lot of us have a nursing aunt or uncle who works in Saudi Arabia or the UK or whatever the case may be. Why? Because we were training quality individuals in this country. It wasn't a centralized process. And equally, the training of doctors in this country, we need to bring in the private sector to augment the ability to train these individuals. But again, Thank you to both my guests on this particular one. I must move us on, guys, to another topic that dominated the news cycle this week, the KZN police. Goodness me. Depending on where you're sitting on this issue, either you're tipping your hat at these brave men and women in blue, or you are frothing at the mouth because they're killing criminals. And yes, that is a real thing. There are people who are really upset. Like KZN police in this country, that is the KwaZulu-Natal police force that is led by Provincial Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkwanazi. What a champ of an individual. In fact, we've named him Champ of the Week on the show on an occasion. Basically saying, that's it, we're done smiling and giggling with criminals. We are going to take these individuals out, especially because the nature of the criminals they're dealing with are violent individuals. These are violent criminals that often, when confronted by law enforcement, shoot with a wanton disregard for the lives of the public or even those police officers. Again, don't take it from me. Let me introduce what sparked this conversation once again this week, where quite a few incidents happened. Two were very prominent: a shootout with violent criminals in the Inanda area, resulting in some suspects three suspects, killed in that part of the world. Let me just give you a quick soundbite from Nhlanhla Mkwanazi, who of course is the KZN Police Commissioner, that's the Provincial Commissioner, speaking to the SABC. Fair use, I need to say that because they'll put a strike on my channel. Fair use. This was him responding to a question to a journalist from the SABC. And even as I'm putting that up, folks, do me a solid favor, smash that like button, please.
It's an incident that happened in Inanda precinct area. Basically, police were following on information that involved the suspects that are involved with quite a lot of criminal activities in the area, including murders. As we said earlier, a police officer was also shot and killed last year on June. So that's what basically the police were doing. We're following those suspects until they found them in this area. And fortunately, there was a shootout, and then the three of them died. Inanda is a very bad place in our country. There's quite a lot of criminal activities that are happening in the area. The terrain in the area, it's very informal structures that you find in this area. It's a kind of a rural setup, township setup, informal settlement. So it's a mix of everything in one area. That's why I think there's quite a lot of people that are residing in this area who are working closer to town, and they use this area as a place to live. And the criminals are taking advantage of that. They pickpocket people as they're going to work, and they rob people in their houses, and they're also involved in murders.
Absolutely. Again, that was just the one incident that he's referring to where he saw three individuals shot. And again, let me just augment what he was saying, that particular area of Inanda. In the background, that's what you see. My bad. Sorry, I don't know if you heard that. Like an advert went off. Anyway, the area of Inanda that he's speaking about is absolutely a hellhole for the residents who live there. And why? Because of its nature as a place where most people who migrate from rural areas looking for opportunities in cities often find Inanda as being a place where they'll find accommodation. Now, that's not me pinning this on rural people moving to there, but rather pinning it on the fact that because a lot of the dwellings are informal, you simply don't know who your neighbors are. And that lends itself to more criminal elements residing there. I mean, I can name these areas. They're in the top 10 of the most violent crimes in the country. Inand is one of them. KwaMashu is one of them. Again, not just in these particular provinces. It's often in the informal settlements where these violent criminals find it easier to hide. And why? SAPS simply can't go in to these areas to be visible because there's no roads or whatever the case may be, poor planning and the like. But more than that, it is a great hiding place because they then introduce a culture of fear into these communities. So if you're a law-abiding individual, a sane, sober, moral, prudent type person living there, you simply have to keep quiet about the violent thug that lives next to you because he's threatening the very people he lives around. And it's that difficulty that SAPS has in finding these individuals. So that, guys, as I throw this issue to you, there's two major victories here, besides the shootouts that are seeing these criminals being eliminated. The other issue is the provincial commissioner, whose voice you just heard now. Because of his tough stance on crime, because of the victories he's notching in terms of defeating these criminals, it's building massive trust between police and the public are now bringing forth information and intelligence that's helping these specialized units in KwaZulu-Natal go after these hardened criminals. Maybe that's the lesson here, the moral of the story, which is being lost, of course, in the brouhaha about, police are killing suspects. Before I throw it to you, I'm going to throw it to you, Makone, first. Let me read from this piece in the Daily, and they said Daily Wire. Shout out to Ben Shapiro, our friends over the Daily Wire. Journalist Velani Lutiti did a great piece, basically revealing that, basically in the last, 3 months, I believe, 40 suspects have basically been killed by the police. Again, not just random killings, but these are guys who, when police arrive to arrest them, they effectively try and shoot at police. Let me put that up on screen. Please bear with me, folks. It takes a second to do that. And then we'll have a quick discussion on it. Makone, just brace yourself. I'll come to you first. There it is on screen. I'm just going to make it slightly bigger. In the 3 months, this is a story in the Daily Maverick. In the 3 months, more than 40 suspects suspected of criminality have been killed in the province, with Friday's incident resulting in 5 deaths. Now, the Friday incident he's referring to is another shooting that happened in the Iskawini area. This after, in the first instance, the KZN Provincial Stabilization Team, which is part of Operation Vala Umkoti, which is Zulu for close the hole or close the gap, acted on intelligence regarding the whereabouts of 3 suspects linked to at least 10 murder cases in the province. When police arrived at the identified house in Kwagengezwa, they were met with gunfire from the suspects. Of course, the police returning fire and fatally wounding all 3 suspects. And of course, the piece goes on to detail other incidents where the shootouts have occurred with the police, thank you God, coming out on top and eliminating criminals. Now, again, Makone, I'm busy saying thank you God, tip my hat off. There are people who are literally frothing at the mouth at this and saying, oh, how dare the police kill criminals? They should be arresting these individuals. Leave aside the fact that the criminals themselves are shooting at the cops, but cops should be arresting these criminals no matter what, Makone.
I could tell from your introduction, Sihle, that you have a great reverence for Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkwanazi. I must tell you that I too pay attention and I sit up when he speaks or when he appears on the news, because he's actually one of the few people in civil service who are famous for doing their job and getting their job done. He has built that public trust by producing results, right? And so I too also pay close attention to what he does and what he says. I must tell you, I'm not very familiar with KwaZulu-Natal, but I've heard of the place Inanda before and of the violence there. And so I had a look too at statistics specifically that carry the theme and the motif of suspects engaging the police in a shootout when they are meant to be arrested. And I found that there were 4 suspects who were killed in October for that very same thing of first engaging the police in a match of exchanging guns. The second one I found was in January. 2 more suspects were killed. The third was in June. 6 suspects were killed also who engaged in a police shootout. And the third is the one that we just saw now, which is 3 suspects who were linked to the murder of a police officer last year, I believe, 3 of 4. So I'm assuming that more of this will be carrying on in Inand. And I've also listened to Lieutenant General Mkwanazi say that specifically in Inanda, that seems to be the attitude of suspects who are about to get arrested, is they take it upon themselves to engage the police this way. So when I believe this is certainly what happened in this last instance as well, at least that's what was described in an article that I read, that when suspects were advised to put their guns down and volunteer themselves up for arrest, they began shooting out at the police. And the general has a zero tolerance principle on that, which is meeting and fighting fire with fire, right? And I understand that people have a problem with that. And I think we should actually have that conversation about force continuum, conversation about reasonable force. I'm not convinced that people that have brought up an issue with police fighting fire with fire essentially have actually looked into the fact that this is the attitude of many of these gang or suspects in the specific area of KwaZulu-Natal, that this is just generally how they've been approaching the police, but also that this is a second to second, moment to moment. These life-changing, life-altering decisions happen in a matter of seconds. And so I think a little bit of benefit needs to be given to the police in those instances. And I also saw a comment, somebody saying there that any police who's brave enough to go and enter into Inanda is very brave because it's known for this level of violence, right? You can understand the sort of brazen criminal it takes to fight the police by trying to kill them first when they are apprehending them. But also,
Absolutely.
as I've just listed, incident after incident, this is not unique. This is not the first one, right? So there's clearly that problem that happens there in Inanda. Sorry, I thought you had something to say.
I was just saying, it goes beyond Inanda, it goes beyond KwaZulu-Natal. We have a criminal class in this country, whether it's your low brow criminal or the very sort of high brow criminal elites in this country, who have zero respect for the rule of law and are very happy. If they're very happy to shoot at police in this country, they are equally as happy and as brazen in shooting at the public. Again, it's not relegated to KwaZulu-Natal. I can take you on a 2-hour flight over to the Western Cape, specifically Cape Town, the Cape Flats, where it's become an almost war zone in parts of that world, Manenberg and the like Lavender Hill, etc., where there are brazen shootouts. And often the police, when they're entering these areas, are under fire themselves. It is in almost effect a civil war. You're watching it. Again, I'm being hyperbolic by using the expression civil war, but I use the expression in the sense of the ubiquitousness or the commonness of gunfire on the place out on the streets there, where people are relegated to hiding in their homes because they're not safe. Peirru, let me throw it to you. Because,
may I just add, Sihle, before you pan over to Peirru, to those people who are clutching their pearls comfortably from their couches in Bryanston, who do not know the lived experiences of people in Inanda, who themselves are not complaining about having police presence and police pushback against such violent activity in their backyards. If the people and the residents of Inanda are volunteering information to the police and inviting them to come and apprehend these criminals who are terrorizing their communities, why should we have an issue? I think let's think about the sort of environment that people who grow and live and go to school in Inanda must exist in to have this level of brazen criminality happen in the very back of their neighborhoods, in the very back of their houses. Now, I would take their word over, again, my friends in Bryanston who are sitting comfortably on their couches, who I have no hard feelings over. But I'm just saying, I think there are multiple realities that we're living in, and sometimes I think it goes right over our heads, the sort of experiences other South Africans are living in.
Absolutely. And that exact point is what I wanted to throw to Peirru. There are individuals in this country who simply, because of the amount of resources that back them up, that create a thick wedge between them and the criminality, whether it's the high walls, the electric fences, the barbed wire, the burglar bars on our gates, the private security. In some cases, some people have actual security officers stationed at their gates. Some people can lose sight of, often poor people, and really the rest of South Africa doesn't have that level of security. And for them, the police are that thin blue line between them and the criminals. We need a sense of perspective here, Peirru, don't we?
Thank you. Sorry, I was just muted there. Look, let me have a different view on where do we start, because the main thing from my side is always, with regards to our work that we do, is we always say communities need to empower themselves. That's where we start. So the community needs to take care of themselves. So you need to be able to give them the equipment as well as the assurance that when they do take care of themselves, obviously the police will assist them. Because the main thing here, as we know in South Africa, when it comes to whistleblowers, we don't have a good reputation. That's also one of the major issues we sit with. So from our side, we have always said community policing, it is utmost necessary, because the police is simply do not have the manpower. It's again, the issue here is manpower. We do not have enough people to be able to render visible policing in these communities. And that's why the criminals will take care of areas where you don't have, policing on a regular basis. And this is where the communities then have to take care of themselves. So find systems, put things in place for the communities to be able to report suspicious behavior, things like that. And be able to assist them at least at the beginning of this process. Give them the power and give them the power back so that they can take care of themselves, and the training that's necessary, because obviously you don't want people to get in trouble. I myself was involved in community policing before. So you need to have proper training. You need to know you basically the eyes and the ears of the police. You should not get involved in activities that would result in injury or harm to anybody. You should just be the ears and the eyes for the police, and then assist the police, because they simply don't have enough manpower. Then the next issue is, again, it's a legacy of our country, is the unemployment rate. It is because of the unemployment rate you have all these criminal, coming up all over the place. There's criminal activities. Obviously, people need to take care of themselves. They will get involved in criminal activities themselves. Not as violent and necessary, but the main thing is now, if you meet violence with violence, people expect that. And my biggest concern here is, once again, it is the innocent that would, be caught in the middle of this gunfights and all of these issues, because that's where my concern would be. Is the police trained to be able to deal with such violent criminals? In other words, being in a position to take care of themselves, because they're also a father, they also, someone's father, someone's uncle, someone's, aunt. They also form part of those very same communities. But now criminals know that they are going to be met with, gunfight, and they'll be prepared for it. And they'll obviously, from their side, they will do the utmost not to be, in a position where they will be caught. So they will defend themselves, and they will be properly trained. So the main thing here is my only concern is that, from the policing side, do we train them effectively? Can they deal with violent criminals? And do we have enough police? So, yeah, I'm not well versed when it comes to, KZN and the issues they deal with. But for me, it's always, you can draw it back to all of the issues. I think I'm talking under correction, but I think Section 27 did a study on what is real, minimum loan, what should be actually everybody's salary. If you look at communities, and then you look at basic things, you look at tar roads, lights in the road, things like that. Those are things, Makone, that you have mentioned, that the people with their polls, they should think about these things, because the main thing that you need to understand is, I think it's around about 12,000, I'm talking under correction, that should be the minimum loan. Because if everybody in the community earns around about 12,000, it means that you will have tarred roads, you will have lights, you will have all of those things. So up until we get to a position where we cannot uplift people out of poverty, we will always sit with these type of situations. And that is, maybe that's my point on this. And then obviously we can take it forward from there. Thanks.
As I admit myself too, even as you're saying this, you are absolutely raising valid points here about the effectiveness of force over a period of time, right? Because it's iterative. It goes back and forth. As criminals become more violent and SAPS matching their violent nature, of course, the criminals bump up their violence, and it becomes sort of escalating. But it reaches a certain point where the cost of doing a crime becomes too heavy for a criminal versus, of course, the opportunity of that said crime. And what increases the cost of a crime is threefold. Number one, visible policing. The idea that the resources of the state that are meant to enforce law are visible and are present in our communities in a very real way. That element requires multiple things, of course. We've just touched on it. For example, it's very difficult for police to be visible where there's poor access to a community, as is always the case with informal settlements, right? There's no real roads that a police worker can weave through. And we're just not at that point yet. Again, Peirru, you raised the point, because of the manpower issues of SAPS. SAPS is severely understaffed in this country, and the rise of the private sector is testament to that. For every one police officer in this country, there are 5 private security officials in this country. Again, underpinning the fact that SAPS is under-resourced severely in this country. But again, the point I was driving at with those 3 things, right, is visible policing on the one hand is difficult if you don't have access. Areas are not built for police to be able to enter, be visible, be seen, and to be a deterrent to crime. And of course, the second element here is a very important one. What are the social factors that are contributing to crime? I'm not of the thesis that poverty equals crime necessarily. I would never lay being poor as a result sort of necessitating you to do crime, but I do think it's a culture issue. Are we creating a culture in this country where people respect life, liberty, their freedom that is, and the freedom of others to live their lives they please, and property rights? The idea that I cannot take someone else's stuff if it's not mine, and if I don't have consent of that individual. And that's where I think we're falling short. And the last area, of course, is political will. In this country, we've had for the last, 12 years or so, an asshat, as I used to call him on this show, of a police minister. There was seriously zero political will under the leadership of uBheki when it came to SAPS. The same Bheki, who I'm not going to pin the blame on him only, his party, for the last 30 years of governance, has systematically degraded the South African policing service by flop after flop after flop. One such flop was the disbanding of specialized units, if you remember, almost about 20 years ago, because they argued, there should be one police force, every cop should be able to do everything, which is absolute nonsense. It goes against international best practice. And worse yet, centralizing policing and limiting the role of local policing, that's local municipal policing, because they wanted to have one police service. Again, I'm making the argument here that policy has also weakened our ability to fight crime. And we're seeing the effects of that, aren't we? Insofar as private security, and I'm going to throw it to you, Makone, in a moment, and then to you, Peirru, then we'll wrap the section up. Private security in this country, the various levels of it, whether it's high-end, close personal protection for VIPs or cash in transit type stuff, the sort of high-end specialized security, all the way to your local, community policing forum, neighborhood watch. In my township of Umlazi, we introduced, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'll speak around it. We introduced guys who would, in the evenings, don reflective vests and wait at bus stops and taxi stops in the evening. So from about 6 p.m. to 1 p.m. or so that those people who come from night duty type jobs have safety when they jump off the bus or the taxi, and they can actually then walk home relatively safe. And who are these guys? It's usually young unemployed guys in the area who form part of the community safety structures. And again, some of us had spears, were Zulus guys. Others who were licensed had firearms, of course, and they know the law around how to use that. But it speaks to that point that Peirru makes, Makone, of the community has to be involved.
Absolutely. I was also trying to look up the number of community policing forums we had. I get the instinct, as you and Peirru do, that we've likely seen a rise in those because the police has just been lacking in capacity. But there are actually no figures about that out there. But I have also seen statements from the Lieutenant General Mkwanazi about encouraging members of communities, specifically in KwaZulu-Natal, to form community policing forums so that they can, again, provide security in various extents, of course, to their communities. However, he's also raised the issue of touting the fine line between community policing forum and vigilantism. And I think we know from South African history, especially in townships, that sometimes those things, people taking the law into their own hands, goes awfully wrong. But it speaks to Peirru's point earlier of having community policing forums working closely with the police so that they are provided with training and resources, right? So that they apply the same restraint that a police officer would, but also that they operate well within their limits. They are not police officers. They are the eyes and the ears of the police, but they should by no means act as though they have the equal amount of monopoly on violence, say, that the police have. But he has encouraged that those CPFs specifically operates with caution, because he's seen them operating in a way that perpetuates crime, as he said. But I also think that we have seen a rise of police visibility and greater police presence in KwaZulu-Natal, particularly because of the elections. I believe it was General Fani Masemola who said that they'd be deploying 500 more additional police officers in KwaZulu-Natal as well as the Eastern Cape, because they were identified as hotspots of particularly election-related crimes. What we have seen, as confirmed by Lieutenant General Mkwanazi, is that there's been not just 500, but an additional 1,000 police designated specifically to KwaZulu-Natal, starting on in early May. I believe those additional police are still deployed even now post the elections, and they were deployed there specifically to safeguard our democracy against nefarious actors who wanted to, cause lots of disruption during the election. But we've seen them not only operating specifically where elections are concerned or where voting stations, those hotspot voting stations are concerned, but also beyond that scope, because there's been an increase in the number of seizures, for example, of illicit goods. Some 2,000 kgs worth of drugs worth millions and millions were seized as a result of this operation of having greater police deployment and police visibility in KwaZulu-Natal. And so we're already seeing the results of that pay off, even though that was not initially what they were deployed there for. I think it raises the question about budget cuts, right? Because we have seen that the budget for policing has been reduced, likely to fund things like the NHI, right? Just so ironic watching the government just neglect their fundamental reason for government presence, government existence. It's to protect citizens from violence, right? But they've neglected that. You're not only seeing that in terms of budget allocations, but also just looking at police services as a percentage of GDP in the country, where you're seeing population increase in the country, you're seeing GDP fluctuating, but you're seeing that proportion of policing just remaining stagnant. You cannot have, you cannot even have investment in a country without that bedrock of safety and security. And so it's something that General Fani Masemola has also raised concerns about budgetary cuts, because already we have so few police. As you indicated, for every one policeman, there's 5 private security personnel. We are encouraging the rise of private militia, much to the state's neglect of its first and most important reason for existence, which is to provide safety and security against violence. So I see that we can all see that greater police visibility in KwaZulu-Natal has been paying off, but I wonder how sustainable that is with all the budget cuts that are being unrolled.
Absolutely. I mean, the multiple areas you're speaking to there, but Peirru, I'm going to throw it to you just for the last comment, and I'm going to move us on, and we're in the last 15 minutes basically of the show. Peirru, I have the fortune and misfortune, let me call it that way, of experiencing all 3 aspects of South African society in terms of where I live, where I work, etc., etc. On the one hand, I was born in a township, Mlazi, just outside Durban, and it's one of the most violent townships in the country, top 10, when it comes to the figures of the 3 contact crimes, murder and armed robberies and the like. I have a farm, a family farm. I won't say where because some people are crazy. I don't want people coming onto my farm. That's where I'm most vulnerable. But I'm on a farm, and there are very different safety issues for me there, because when I'm on the farm, I'm very far from our local police station, and effectively my neighbors also reasonably far from me. My closest neighbor is sort of about, a kilometer from me. So we formed our own farm security-based operation. And of course, when I'm here in Joburg for the show, it's an urban, lifestyle. I live in the city. I also won't say exactly where, because people are crazy out here. The point I'm getting at, all three areas where people live, fellow South Africans like you and I, are facing a serious challenge of violent criminality. And it's that South African, perhaps, who looks at the story of KZN and the broader wins that SAPS do, on occasion register. And they say, you know what, this is what we want. There's been a growing call for the provincial commissioner, Nhlanhla Mkwanazi, of KZN to become the national commissioner. Again, not because, of the violent shootouts. I don't think that's what people are focusing on, but rather a instilling of a discipline within the police force that actually says we have a zero tolerance, as Makone said, for violent criminality. And we have that zero tolerance on behalf of the South African who ordinarily can't defend themselves. Should we be encouraging this kind of level of professionalism, if you will, from leaders within the civil service, especially policing, who are tasked with protecting our rights?
Yeah, most definitely. If there's people that, like I said, the same with our other discussions, you've got people that are professional, that are, driven to serve their communities, and we should give them the necessary tools and the manpower to be able to deal with the needs of the community. In the end, if you have visible policing, if you have active communities that partake in, making it safe for themselves, as well as knowing your rights as a worker. I always say, where most people fail is they don't tend to not know their rights. That's why they affiliate with unions in the end, as to basically look after them. We sit with situations where, I don't know if people understand that, an employer, if they employ you after 6 p.m, they are responsible to ensure you have, a safe way to get home. They must make sure there is transport available. So I think people don't always know these types of things, and then if they don't know it, they don't know how to act on those rights that they have. And the only thing why I'm thinking of this is where you mentioned, the bus stops and things like that. So, does the employer really take care of their assets? Do they really care for their staff and make sure that they are safe when they get home? That's one of the things that we need to start looking at. And then obviously all of the other things that you've mentioned to ensure we have the right people in the jobs. We don't have people there for own gain. We have people there that actually want to serve the community, and make sure we deal with that from that point of view. Thank you.
Absolutely. Guys, I'm going to move us on. As I said, we're in that last few minutes here. Just as a final point, also because we can't rely on SAPS, for the various reasons named here, we should be encouraging a responsible gun culture in this country, where people view having the tool to defend their life, liberty, and property, i.e. a firearm, it should be a right, in my view, in this country, and not this sort of nonsense we often hear, especially from the previous administration. Let me not prejudice the current Minister, Usenzo Mchunu. I have a little bit of hope in him, but the jury's out. But we should be reforming the ability for citizens to own firearms in this country. Again, I think we have enough laws around that, enough regulation around it. The process should just be a lot more streamlined, perhaps. But again, we'll cover this in other shows. We're going to have other guests who are much more well-versed on this, but unfortunately they had things come up and they couldn't join us. Gideon Joubert. But let me move us on to perhaps our final topic, because really and we'll be brief on this one because I've kind of covered it this week when I had Helen Ziller on the show, and purposefully had Helen on the show because the DA, as you'll know, this week on Monday, launched court papers basically challenging the appointment of John Hlophe. That's the former judge president of the Western Cape courts, a former judge disgraced after he was effectively impeached by the Judicial Services Committee, and then Parliament ratifying that by firing him from being a judge. That same Judge Hlophe then making a comeback, almost like, a Frankensteinish zombie rising from the dead. This time as a MP, a member of parliament for the MK party. Now, how's that for irony, guys? The same guy who was impeached, i.e. fired, for allegedly, it was proven that he tried to unduly, that is, influence a judgment on behalf of Jacob Zuma, then returns to Parliament, or comes to Parliament this time as an MP for the party led by Jacob Zuma. So much for a defense around, it wasn't me, I didn't do that for JZ, wink, wink. But nonetheless, I had Helen Ziller on for this one. I want to play a quick clip from that episode that we did, Helen explaining why the DA took took Parliament effectively to court, challenging this particular decision. And as I struggled to put this on screen, a reminder to you, dear viewer, smash that like button and share this stream. There she is. I hope this is the right part of it, but let's go. It's important for the DA to take this matter to court.
Well, the DA has very long championed the independence of the judiciary, as every single South African should, because our democracy depends on it. And the JSC, the Judicial Services Commission, has certain functions, and one of those functions is to nominate judges for appointment to the bench. Now, they undertake those interviews and then they nominate judges. And as far as the DA is concerned, there are far too many politicians on that body. We think there should be really respected retired jurists and other legal academics and other people who really understand the law on that body, but there are politicians. And we think that if politicians have to be there, they should be far fewer in number, because we really believe it's important to entrench the independence of the judiciary from the political process, and certainly from party politics. Nevertheless, under the law and under the Constitution as it stands, Parliament may designate representatives of various political parties to the JSC, and the only constraint on Parliament in terms of the total number is that 3 of those have to be from opposition parties. So the ANC can't take the whole lot. And obviously, MK...
Helen, sorry, I don't...
Can you hear me?
Okay. We're definitely having some gremlins. Helen, the line is very bad.
Right.
Basically lost you at the point of explaining why having as many politicians as there are on the commission is not a problem to an extent. Do you want to just maybe take it from there, sorry?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
You're back.
No.
When you asked whether we can hear you, we heard that.
All right, good. Let me go then. So there's too many politicians, but nevertheless, politicians do have the right to propose representatives, and MK also has that right. What we're saying is it makes no rational sense for Parliament to designate someone who has been impeached and fired through the Judicial Services Commission to be a member of that very body to interview and propose judges for appointment to the bench. Now, obviously, our constitution writers could never have envisaged that any such thing would have been a possibility, but it's turned out to be. And of course, it's a threat to the independence of the judiciary, and it's a threat to the credibility of the judiciary, and it's also irrational, and all the decisions by organs of state have to be rational. So we've basically taken it on those grounds, and we've asked for 2 remedies. The first remedy is to interdict John Hlophe from taking up that seat, and the second is to go back to Parliament and say, you erred, you made a mistake. Doesn't mean to say MK can't have a representative, but they just can't have John Hlophe. Now
Sorry, CJ, I don't think we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes.
My bad. As I was saying, if you want to watch the full interview, please head on over to the Big Daddy Liberty channel over on YouTube and on Facebook. It was this past Wednesday's Big Daddy Liberty show. Guys, I'm going to be very brief on this one because we've effectively run out of time. Peirru, I'm going to throw it to you first here because I think there's just one concept that I think is quite right. And, from an employer perspective, the principle would carry too. And that's the idea that, if I was fired for theft, for example, if I was fired for lying from my employer, it would be weird if I then came back to that same organization or similar organization, maybe another division, to then, pick or have the power rather to pick or choose the people who head up committees that investigate, a liar or a thief in the workplace. For example, HR. It would be deeply unethical, deeply dubious to do something like that. But here we are sitting in a situation where former Judge President John Hlophe, fired by the JSC, that's the Judicial Services Commission, and Parliament, now in Parliament, sitting on that same, having been appointed on that same Judicial Services Commission, choosing the future judges of the country. It's simply unethical.
Yeah, it simply doesn't make sense. It's one of those irrational things that we say that you see on a daily basis in our communities and in our country. It simply doesn't make sense. If you want to have a credible system, obviously you have to have credible people involved in that system. And this is where we need to remove politics from that, because that is the main issue always, is politics is involved in every decision that's made in this country, every sector, everything. The moment you bring politics into it, it creates havoc. And that's why we say, this is one area that, the judicial system is one of those areas that we simply can't afford to have politics involved in it. It has to be independent. It has to be able to deal with the issues at hand and without influence and without, government having a say in what they need to do. And I think if we allow this to continue, obviously it will have a negative impact. Let me stop there for now.
Absolutely. I mean, Makone, as I throw it to you, it's not just the DA, because I don't want people thinking, it's just the DA. Of course they'll go after John Hlophe, because that was the commentary we received during that live broadcast. It's actually also civil society organizations and even members of the legal fraternity who are finding this appointment of John Hlophe to the Judicial Services Commission deeply unethical. In fact, Freedom Under Law is also taking this matter to court. Let me just quickly, Makone, just for your purposes, read from a daily, Mail and Guardian piece where they give comment on this, and I'll bring you in on this particular issue. Again, their leader there, Judith February, if I'm not mistaken, not mincing her words on this particular issue, saying in this piece, let me just make it bigger there, like the DA, this is a piece from the Mail and Guardian, like the Democratic Alliance, Freedom Under Law have approached the Western Cape High Court on an urgent basis, both arguing that it's imperative, it's important, that is, that the court intervenes before the Judicial Services Commission convenes or sits in October to interview candidates for positions to the Constitutional Court, the Appellate Court, and several within its own division, including that of Judge President. It is the post John Hlophe, by the way, held before he was removed from the bench 5 months ago, becoming the first judge to suffer this fate of being impeached in the democratic era. Now, the last sentence I just reads that in its founding affidavit, Freedom Under Law recalled that Hlophe was impeached for one of the most serious of reasons. And that's perhaps the issue at heart here, amongst others. It's an idea of what standard then do we maintain within the state if someone like John Hlophe can actually be appointed to the Judicial Services Committee and none within the political elites bat an eyelid, except for the DA perhaps?
I do agree with Helen Zille that we should limit political interference as it relates to the judiciary. If you actually look across the branches of government, that is the legislature, the executive, as well as the judiciary has been the lone star in terms of maintaining its independence, maybe with the exception here and there of the NPA. But I think they have really been a beacon of democratic independence and the source of great legitimacy in this country. But I do think the record of Judge Hlophe and his impeachment does diminish that legitimacy, because, like you indicated, how can an impeached judge be fit to test the fitness of other judges and their right to stand as judges? But I do think that when I've watched his performance in Parliament for the short while that he's been there, he would have actually been a worthy opponent of the DA, because the DA now being in government means there's a huge vacancy for quality opposition in the country that doesn't just reduce Parliament to personal epithets and insults and a lot of nothingness in the back and forth, but he's actually provided some substantive and I think great conversation that people want to see being engaged in Parliament. And I think, but for his impeachment, he would have been a great person to have in Parliament to represent certainly a core group of South Africans who advocate some of the things he proposes, like, for example, doing away with Roman Dutch law. May not agree with him on that, but I do think he actually represents more than just superficial things like race and those sort of things, but I think he represents a core group of South Africans who share the same values as him, and he does it without reducing the quality of dialogue, at least in Parliament. Unfortunately, there's nothing else to be said about his own record as a judge, which is that he's been impeached and therefore does not pass the fit and proper test, and so cannot assess the fitness again of other judges to stand. He's lost all legitimacy.
Well, even as he's saying this, and guys, we've had to wrap it up now. I'll just say this, because as I've said on the channel, we will be watching the story and keeping tabs on it, because the initial defense we're seeing John Hlophe and the MK party put forward is twofold. On the one hand, Hlophe himself is saying, well, actually, this hasn't played out in court at a requisite level for the impeachment to have gone ahead. He's calling it premature. Now, as he's saying this, bear in mind, this thing played out over 16 years. So for him to say, it happened overnight, it's classic Jacob Zuma Stalingrad technique of delaying and stretching something out. But nonetheless, that's the first argument he's putting forth as a defense, seemingly, if my reading of him and what he's been saying is anything to go by. It was all rushed. He shouldn't have been impeached, is the first argument. The second argument he's making is, well, actually, even if the impeachment is, in his view, legit, well, sitting on the JSC, he says, doesn't require that element of being fit and proper, is the second argument we're hearing from them, which is a stupefying thing to say when you're being put in a position to pick the future judges of this country who should be fit and proper. Again, you saw some comments coming up on here with people echoing that sentiment that maybe politicians, even if, they're isolating certain characters. Richard Lemmer here saying, even Malema has no place on the JSC with his rhetoric. And of course, Mary Sinclair saying MK just wanted to stick it to the DA with a message from John Hlophe. I mean, even that idea that maybe no politicians should be sitting on such a body is an interesting one. But again, we'll pick this one up. As always, we'll be watching the story and many more. Let me thank both of my guests for having joined us on Liberty and Friends this week. As I always do in the last segment, I give my guests an opportunity to have the last word and to let us know how we can find them or the organizations if you want to get in touch with them. I don't mean personal numbers, guys. Just like social media, if you have social media, or if you write somewhere, like you are a contributor to, I don't know, whatever publication, you're welcome to share that information here. Peirru, how can we find you or Solidarity if we're looking to get in touch with the organization?
Thank you for your time, and thank you for the viewers as well. From my side, you're welcome to contact me. You can just send an email to medies@solidariteit.co.za. So that is for our team. I was looking forward to one of your discussion points, which were the assets being seized for the PPE funding. Maybe we'll deal with that at a later stage. But that is from our side. We were happy to be invited to your show. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to obviously vent our views, as well as bring some clarification with regards to NHI and centralization of power. But those that are interested in discussing it further with myself, you can send an email and then we can deal with it from that side. Thank you for the team and have a great evening.
Absolutely. That is Peirru Marx from Solidarity. Makone Maja from IRR. How do the folks find your writing, your contributions, and how do they get in touch with you on social media if you want to be found?
I can be found on the Institute's website. So if you're looking for great ideas about personal freedom and want organizations that defend individual liberty and the right to pursue happiness, please look up the Institute. We're everywhere. We're on Twitter. We are definitely on LinkedIn, and we have a website where the Institute of Race Relations. We've covered virtually every topic you can think of. Quite literally, the Institute's been around for over 100 years. I'm sure Sihle has talked your ear off about the Institute. Occasionally, I contribute to the Daily Friends website, and I appear on the Daily Friends show as well, mostly on Thursdays. So that's definitely where you can catch me as well. You're on mute, Sihle.
Say this as a quick message. Both these guests, well, it's the first time on Liberty and Friends, so they definitely deserve a round of applause to both of them. And I'm hoping you guys could actually hear that. And I'm just sort of arbitrarily hang around in the background. A massive thanks to both my guests. As I say goodbye to them, let me say thank you, dear viewer, for watching the show tonight. And a big thanks. I am seeing the comments, guys, people wondering why we haven't covered some issues. I can see the Wit Rivier terrorist training camp or military training camp in Mpumalanga. We'll cover that. We were hoping to cover that tonight with a few experts in the security area, but they really couldn't make it onto the show. So we'll park it, guys, for maybe Wednesday, and I might actually head out to that part of the world to speak to residents on the ground, because this is a bigger story than perhaps is what is playing out in the mainstream media. Questions around this are, what are individuals from countries like Libya doing seeking training here? These, by the way, are countries that are war-torn and have the distinct problem of radical Islamic terrorism operating there. Are we seeing South Africa becoming a training ground, a fertile training ground for this kind of terrorism? Especially because we already know, if you see the recent research that's come out, that South Africa is playing a role, unfortunately, as a facilitator of funding for radical terrorist groupings around the world. Do we actually have these guys training here in the country? This is a real question to ask, especially if you take your mind back a few months ago to scenes in Cape Town, where as a group of individuals were praying for the hostages that were taken from Israel, a counter group then accosted them and basically waved the flags of terrorist groupings, radically Islamic terrorist groupings like ISIS and Hezbollah and Hamas at these people. Are we seeing more than just people expressing flags, and are we maybe seeing these terrorist groupings train and get funding from here? We'll uncover that and have that conversation perhaps on Wednesday with some security experts, because if it is the case, my goodness, we need to prepare as South Africans. But again, we'll cover that and many other issues on future episodes of the show. If you love this content, guys, please, I always say this, and it's not me just saying it for the sake of saying it, smash that like button. Please hit that like button. It really helps get the word out. And if you can do me a favor, drop a comment, leave a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. That's a nice way to get engagement up on the show. And of course, as I always say, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my channel. We've broken that mark of the 45,000 subscribers yesterday. Thank you to you guys. You also get a round of applause for that one. And now maybe the new target is 46,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So please subscribe to the channel. And remember, guys, as I make my way out, we have a website. Find us at bigdaddyliberty.com. We have a few gremlins there we're fixing, struggling with them, but nonetheless, the website will be back. With that being said, thank you for watching. And as I always say at the end of every show, never trust a commie.